Lanterns trembled in the winter wind while the castle walls held the cold like old secrets. The vampire king stood alone on the highest balcony watching the city below, pretending he felt nothing. Kings, he had learned, are not allowed to feel. People feared him, legends painted him dark, yet deep inside he carried a quiet ache he never showed anyone. Tonight, on New Year's Eve, that ache was louder. Bells were waiting to ring, fireworks to bloom, and somewhere beyond the mountains, an ancient prophecy whispered that when the sky broke into light, the king's destiny would awaken, and his heart would decide the fate of all. He walked the corridors slowly, cloak brushing stone, hearing every heartbeat in the castle. The council invited him to join the celebration, but he refused. Tonight, he said he would listen. Outside in the courtyard, snow drifted softly through the air and the sky seemed to hold its breath. That was when he felt it, a warm presence, gentle like a candle. He turned and saw a young woman in a deep red dress standing quietly in the snow. She didn't bow, she didn't tremble. She simply looked at him with eyes that understood pain instead of fearing it. She said she hadn't come by the guards, but by something older, maybe the prophecy itself. She spoke of destiny as if it were alive, as if it had been waiting as long as he had. They stood facing one another as snow fell like sparks between them. He tested her, reminding her what people said about him, cursed, merciless, cold. She nodded, and yet she stayed. Because she said gently, stories are not always true, and even kings deserve to be known, not only feared. Something shifted in his chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for lifetimes, hope. Then the sky exploded into fireworks. Bells rang. Gold light flooded the world, and suddenly a glow formed between their hands, soft at first, then brighter, pulsing like a living heartbeat. It wasn't power. It felt like healing, and with it came fear. Visions flashed across his mind, his kingdom falling, rising, opening, breaking. The prophecy no longer felt like a warning, it felt like a choice. He whispered that if she stayed, everything would change. She asked softly what would happen if she didn't. He looked at the light, at destiny, at the fragile possibility in front of him, and admitted that he might never become what he was meant to be. Another firework roared overhead. The light flared brighter. In that instant, he understood the prophecy was not about doom, it was about love. And love, after losing so much, terrified him more than death. He held her hands, not to trap her but to steady himself. Her eyes remained calm, brave, unafraid, and just as he tried to speak, the light shattered silently, dissolving into the night. The warmth vanished. The courtyard returned to stillness, and the girl was gone. He stood beneath the burning sky, hands empty, heart racing, unsure whether destiny had just gifted him a miracle or stolen one away. For the first time in centuries, he whispered into the cold air, "What have you done to me?" And the night offered no answer. The courtyard felt too large without her. The vampire king stared at the last fading spark in the air as if it might guide him, but the night swallowed everything. Servants continued their quiet routines, unaware that destiny had just crossed the king's path and vanished again. He walked slowly back through the corridors, though each step felt heavier than stone. For years, he had believed the prophecy meant danger, war, sacrifice, but now he understood something far more difficult. It demanded his heart. And hearts were the one thing he had sworn never to use again. Inside the council chamber, voices rose as soon as he entered. The elders spoke of treaties, threats, borders, and numbers, pretending the world could be controlled like an account ledger. None of them sensed what had happened outside. None of them felt the strange echo still lingering in his palms. When they asked why he looked distracted, he simply said, "The night is changing," and their uneasy silence told him they felt it too, even if they didn't understand it. He dismissed them early and returned to the quiet halls where memory walked beside him like a ghost. He remembered the last time he had loved. He remembered how trust had turned to betrayal and how entire kingdoms had bled because of it. Though there had been no gore in his memory, the ache of loss had been enough to teach him never to open himself again. Yet the girl in the red dress hadn't demanded anything. She hadn't reached for power nor begged for mercy. She had simply looked at him as if he was still human somewhere beneath the crown, and that terrified him more deeply than his enemies ever had. He went to the old library, a sanctuary filled with dust and whispers, searching the shelves for the scroll that carried the prophecy. By candlelight, he unrolled the fragile parchment and read the lines again. The words had shifted with time, like water finding new paths through stone. They spoke not of blood, not of conquest, but of choice, of a king whose reign would either freeze the world in fear or thaw it with compassion. As his eyes moved across the faded ink, he saw new meaning hiding between the letters. The prophecy had never promised safety. It had promised transformation. And transformation rarely arrived gently. A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, a breath almost, coming from the shadows between the shelves. He turned, senses alert, but instead of a threat, he felt that same warm echo from the courtyard. A folded ribbon lay on the floor, the color of deep winter berries, dusted faintly with snow. He knew instantly it had been hers. He lifted it slowly, as if touching something fragile and alive, and the faintest shimmer of light pulsed through the fabric, vanishing as quickly as it came. She hadn't simply disappeared. Destiny had taken her somewhere inside the castle, hidden, protected, tested, or perhaps waiting. The king closed his eyes and whispered to the ribbon, not as a ruler, but as someone who had forgotten how to hope. "Where did you go?" The room gave no reply, but the air changed like a path quietly opening. Somewhere below the castle, deep beneath stone and forgotten doors, he heard the faint echo of footsteps, not frightened, not running, simply searching. And for the first time since she vanished, he realized he was no longer afraid of finding her. He was afraid of what might happen if he did not. He gathered his cloak, extinguished the candles, and left the library, guided not by maps or guards, but by instinct and by something softer, something that felt almost like faith. Every corridor seemed to lean forward as he passed, as if the castle itself was watching the king finally walk toward his heart instead of away from it. The bells had long gone silent, fireworks had faded, and midnight had folded into deep night, yet the true beginning of the prophecy was only now awakening. At the top of the staircase leading to the hidden passages beneath the castle, he paused, hand resting on the stone railing. The cold felt different here, not lifeless, but alert, as though the walls remembered secrets they were preparing to reveal. In the darkness below, he sensed her presence again, faint like a candle nearly out of breath, still burning, still waiting. He drew in a slow breath, realizing the next step would change everything. And just as he placed his foot on the first stair, a quiet voice rose from the shadows beneath him, the same gentle voice he thought he had lost, saying his name for the very first time. The sound of his name stopped him cold. No one dared speak it aloud, not servants, not advisors, not even those who had known him before he became king. Yet from the darkness below, her voice carried it gently, as if the name belonged not to a ruler, but to a man who had once dreamed of something simple. He moved down the staircase slowly, each step releasing echoes into the stone. The air grew warmer the deeper he went, as though the castle itself was guiding him toward a hidden heart he had forgotten existed. The passage opened into an old chamber carved beneath the foundations, a place hardly anyone remembered. Flickering lamps glowed along the walls, lit by a hand that had arrived before him. There she was, standing in the soft light, holding the ribbon he had just found, as though it had led her the same way it had led him. Her hair carried traces of snow, yet her eyes were calm, present, steady. She didn't appear frightened or lost. She looked as if she had come exactly where she needed to be. When she saw him, she didn't bow or apologize. She simply breathed as if relieved he had followed. He stepped closer, curiosity and caution braided together. "You vanished," he said softly. "The light, it took you." She nodded, fingers gently closing around the ribbon. "It didn't take me away," she answered. "It brought me deeper. Sometimes truth hides where kings never walk." The words struck him harder than any blade could, deeper than his throne rooms, deeper than his councils, deeper than the image the world believed. She spoke of truth as if it were not a crown to hold, but a mirror he had avoided looking into for far too long. The walls around them were etched with symbols older than any scripture his scholars had studied. They shimmered faintly, not dangerous, not dark, simply ancient. The prophecy was written here too, but not in the version his court recited. These carvings told a fuller story. They spoke of a kingdom frozen not by magic but by fear. They spoke of a king who could rule forever and still be empty unless he learned to choose compassion over distance. As he traced one of the symbols with his fingertips, he felt something loosen inside him, not power, but a weight he had carried for centuries without admitting it. She watched him quietly, then took a small step forward. "You are not the monster the stories made," she said, "but you believed them and so you lived like one." There was no accusation in her voice, only sadness, only truth. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that reveals rather than destroys. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in humility. "Rulers cannot afford softness," he whispered. "Softness is how kingdoms fall." She shook her head slowly. "Hardness is how hearts break. And when the heart of a kingdom breaks, everything cracks with it." The chamber seemed to listen. Even the flames flickered as if reacting to the conversation. He had faced armies, rebellions, threats, yet this quiet honesty unsettled him most, because no sword could protect him here. No law could shield him from what he needed to confront inside himself. He turned away, struggling with the unfamiliar ache rising in his chest. "I lost everything once," he said quietly. "When I cared, people suffered. When I closed myself, they were safe." As she stepped closer, her voice soft but unwavering. Were they safe, or were they simply silent? The question lingered like smoke. He looked back at her, and in that gaze something shifted between them, not love blooming suddenly, not destiny forcing itself, but recognition. Two lives shaped by different worlds, meeting at a quiet crossroads neither expected. She held out the ribbon. "This isn't magic," she said. "It's a reminder. The prophecy never wanted to control you, it wanted to awaken you." The moment he took the ribbon, warmth stirred again, not from enchantment, but from the courage of facing truth. And then the earth trembled, not violently, but deeply, like a giant exhaling beneath the foundation. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The carvings glowed brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. He felt the prophecy move through the walls, not as words, but as intention. Something had been unlocked simply because he chose to listen instead of command. The chamber doors behind them sealed with a soft thud, not trapping them, but declaring that there was still more he needed to see before he could leave. A wind rose from nowhere, carrying faint whispers of voices, past mistakes, old promises, forgotten hopes. The king clenched the ribbon as the light around the symbols gathered and began to form an image on the far wall. He recognized the silhouette instantly. It was his kingdom, but it wasn't as it was now, it was as it could become. And as the vision brightened, he realized with a quiet chill that the future it showed depended entirely on the next choice he would make. The chamber dimmed. The vision paused. The prophecy waited. And the Vampire King understood that nothing, not power, not eternity, not even prophecy itself, would decide the fate of his world. Until he did, the vision on the wall brightened again, slow and deliberate, like dawn unfolding across a silent valley. The Vampire King watched as images shifted, streets filled with laughter instead of fear, children running freely across courtyards where soldiers once stood guard, people approaching the castle not as prisoners but as citizens who belonged. It was a kingdom that breathed differently, softer, lighter, alive. And then, as if turning a page, the vision darkened. The same streets grew empty, doors closed, faces lowered, whispers replaced song. The castle towered larger, colder, a monument to control rather than protection. Both futures shimmered together, overlapping like two possible reflections of the same face. He felt the weight of it. Destiny did not demand war. Destiny demanded responsibility, and that was far heavier. He looked toward the girl, but she said nothing. She let him stand inside the truth by himself. Kings rarely hear silence. They are used to praise, fear, argument, noise. Silence forces them to listen inward, and that is where the hardest conversations always live. His hands tightened slightly. For so long, he had chosen distance because it seemed safer than tenderness. Yet the prophecy was showing him that distance wasn't protection. It was slowly draining life out of everything he was meant to care for. The glow faded and the wall returned to stone. The chamber grew still again, as if it had spoken enough for now. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Why me?" he murmured, more to the room than to her. "There are rulers stronger, wiser, kinder. Why place such a burden here?" She studied him quietly before answering. "Because prophecy doesn't look for perfect hearts. It looks for broken ones that are willing to learn." Oh, there was no grand speech, no dramatic revelation, only that simple truth, and it sank into him deeper than any decree he had ever signed. He turned away and walked slowly across the chamber, running his hand along the carved stone. These walls had existed long before his crown, long before his pain, yet somehow they had been waiting for him. He felt strangely small, not in a humiliating way, but in the way someone feels when they realize they are part of something larger than pride or fear. Humility touched him like a gentle hand on the shoulder. It didn't weaken him, it steadied him. And that quiet steadiness frightened him more than power ever had, because it meant he could no longer hide behind his old excuses. She stepped closer, her voice low but sincere. "You are not being punished," she said. "You are being invited." He looked at her, puzzled. Invited to what? She hesitated, choosing her words with care. To become the version of yourself you've been avoiding. He felt a tremor pass through his chest, the soft ache of recognition. Somewhere beneath centuries of armor and discipline, there was still a man who once believed in gentleness, who once reached out instead of pulling away. He had buried that man because he thought survival required it. Now he realized survival without that part of himself was only another form of slowly dying. A distant rumble rolled beneath the floor, deeper and more insistent than before. The chamber responded like a living thing, not in threat but in awakening. A doorway formed in the far wall, dissolving from stone into open space. Beyond it lay a long, descending passage lit by faint golden light. He sensed that whatever waited below would demand more honesty than anything he had faced so far. Instinct warned him to turn back, to return to his throne and pretend none of this existed. But the prophecy had already touched him, and pretending was no longer something he could wear comfortably. He looked toward her, quietly searching for strength without asking for it aloud. She didn't press him, didn't lead, didn't command. She simply nodded, permission not to obey prophecy but to choose. That difference mattered. It allowed the step he took next to belong truly to him. He moved toward the passage, feeling the air grow warmer as he crossed the threshold. Each footfall echoed softly like footsteps into memory. He sensed old grief waiting, old regrets, the kind that had shaped him without his consent. A king might order armies, but no crown could command the past to behave. The path narrowed, guiding them into a cavern beneath the castle's heart. Here the stone was smooth from centuries of unseen tears. A quiet pool reflected the faint light, still as untouched glass. He knew without being told that this place was meant not for power but for confession. The silence asked nothing and yet asked everything. His throat tightened. It would have been easier to face a battlefield than this simple, patient mirror of water. He knelt slowly, watching his reflection ripple, seeing not the austere ruler the world knew, but the tired man who had been hiding behind him. She stayed a few steps behind, not intruding on the moment, yet present enough that he did not feel abandoned. For the first time, he allowed the truth to rise without forcing it back down. I closed my heart, he said quietly, because when I opened it, people I loved paid the price, so I believed distance was mercy. The pool didn't judge, it only reflected the tremor in his voice. But mercy without closeness became cruelty. I did not mean to harm anyone, yet I did. The words broke free, gentle and painful all at once, loosening something inside him that had been locked for lifetimes. The prophecy did not applaud. It did not strike lightning through the cavern. Instead, the water brightened softly, as if acknowledging honesty the way the dawn acknowledges night before passing it. The warmth that rose through the chamber was not magic. It felt like forgiveness beginning its slow work. He realized then that destiny was not a force dragging him forward. It was a path laid open, one he could choose to walk or ignore. And as that understanding settled into him, another tremor shivered through the earth, not threatening, but urgent, like the world reminding him that time does not wait forever. Somewhere far above, the city breathed, trusting a king who was just now learning how to truly lead. He lifted his gaze from the water and turned toward the girl with something new in his eyes, not power, not command, but a quiet promise forming, fragile and real. Yet before he could speak it aloud, the cavern filled with an unexpected sound, a distant cry echoing through the passageway, frightened and small, as if someone else had stumbled into the depths and needed help. And in that single instant, the prophecy shifted again from introspection to action, leaving the king standing between who he had been and who he would have to become next. The cry echoed again, faint but trembling, bouncing across the stone walls like a lost bird searching for somewhere safe to land. The vampire king rose instantly, the old instinct of command tightening his shoulders, yet something new guided his movement now, softer than authority, stronger than fear. He looked toward the dark passageway beyond the cavern where the sound had come from, and without waiting for reassurance or permission, he began to walk. The girl followed quietly, not as a follower, not as a guide, but as a presence that steadied the air around him. The tunnel curved deeper, the light thinning into threads. Cold mist coiled around their steps, carrying the metallic smell of stone and the faint salt of tears. The king's senses sharpened, not in suspicion, but in concern. He could hear shallow breathing ahead, quick and uneven. When they turned the final corner, the scene revealed itself slowly. A small child sat curled against the wall, arms wrapped around their knees, eyes red from crying. No guards, no magic, no trap. Just a frightened child who had wandered too far into a place meant for secrets. The king felt an ache he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge in years, the ache of seeing fear where trust should have lived. The child flinched when he stepped closer as if expecting punishment. That reaction struck him harder than any prophecy ever could. What had his rule taught his people that the safest response to him was to hide, to tremble, to avoid breathing too loudly? He knelt slowly, lowering himself until his gaze was level, not towering. His voice came out softer than he planned. "You're safe," he said, as if offering a fragile bridge. "No one is angry. Tell me, how did you get here?" Oh, the child hesitated, glancing at the girl for reassurance. She smiled gently and nodded, and only then did the child speak. They explained in broken whispers that they had followed the fireworks' glow, believing it led to something beautiful. A door that only half opened had tempted curiosity. The path had seemed like adventure until the darkness swallowed the way back. The king listened, truly listened, without correcting, without scolding. He remembered his own younger self once seeking light in places no one understood. Compassion rose in him not as a duty, but as recognition. Carefully, he extended his hand, not demanding it be taken. "Come," he murmured, "we'll walk together." When the child placed their small hand into his, he felt something shift, not magical, not prophetic, simply human. The prophecy had not dragged him into this cavern to test power. It had led him here to teach him how to hold someone without control, to guide without fear. As they retraced their steps toward the cavern, the air warmed slightly, and he realized the space responded not to dominance but to tenderness. For the first time, he understood. Strength was never meant to replace gentleness, it was meant to protect it. Back at the pool, the child's breathing steadied. The girl knelt and wiped the tears from their cheeks with the corner of her sleeve. The king watched the moment carefully, seeing in it a truth that carved itself quietly into him. Leadership was not throne height, it was eye level. He turned toward the water once more, and its surface shimmered, reflecting not only his face, but the child's and then hers, 3 lives bound not by fate alone, but by choice. The chamber responded in a way almost imperceptible at first. The carvings along the wall pulsed with soft light, as if acknowledging progress rather than perfection. The prophecy was not finished, but it had taken another breath. The king felt a whisper move through the stone, not in words, but in meaning. Compassion opened doors that force could never touch. He released the child's hand only when they felt steady enough to stand on their own. He turned to the girl, and in his eyes there was something new, a quiet certainty forming like dawn. "I understand now," he said softly. "My kingdom was never asking me to be feared, it was asking me to be present." She nodded, not praising, not congratulating, simply witnessing the truth he had found. And yet before the moment could settle into peace, the ground trembled once more, sharper this time, as though the prophecy had shifted into its final movement. The air thickened with anticipation. Somewhere far above, bells began to ring again, not in celebration but in warning. The child clutched the girl's sleeve. The king lifted his gaze toward the tunnel leading upward, feeling destiny tighten like a drawn bowstring. He knew the journey beneath the castle had led him inward. Now whatever waited above would require him to step outward, to carry everything he had learned into a world that still remembered the cold version of him. He drew a steady breath, gathering courage not from power, but from the gentle hand he had just held and the quiet truth beside him. The prophecy was no longer something happening to him. It was something he was finally ready to answer. And as he turned toward the path back to the surface, the chamber lights flared once, as if blessing the choice, then faded into silence, releasing him to whatever awaited in the breaking night above. They climbed back toward the surface, step by steady step, as if rising through time itself. The air thinned and brightened. Faint sounds from the world above began to return, distant voices, the hush of wind through banners, the echo of bells still warning the night. The vampire king reached the final archway and paused, feeling the difference inside his chest. The weight was still there, but it no longer ruled him. Instead, it felt like responsibility wrapped gently in purpose. The girl stopped beside him, and the child held onto his cloak, trusting him without question. That trust humbled him in a way no throne ever had. The courtyard opened before them, washed in the fading glow of the last fireworks. Embers drifted through the sky like quiet stars. People stood gathered near the gates, anxious and uncertain, whispering about the tremors, about what the prophecy might mean, about whether darkness was returning. When the king appeared, silence swept the crowd the way a winter wind freezes a river. Faces stiffened. Some bowed quickly. Others lowered their eyes. They were not hateful, they were afraid. And for the first time, he saw clearly how deeply fear had shaped the life of his kingdom. He did not raise his voice. He did not command. Instead, he walked down the steps slowly, still holding the child's hand. That small gesture alone changed the air. Whispers softened. Someone gasped quietly. The girl stood slightly behind him, not as a symbol, not as power, simply as the presence destiny had woven in at the right moment. He looked over his people and understood that the prophecy had never been about fireworks or signs in the sky. It had always been about this, whether he would finally show his heart where it mattered most. The bells faded, the night waited. He spoke simply. I have ruled with distance, he said, his words carrying not authority but honesty. I believed fear would protect you. I see now that fear only kept us apart. His voice didn't tremble, yet it carried the softness of someone who had finally stopped hiding. He glanced down at the child, then back to the crowd. From this night forward, I choose differently. I choose presence. I choose compassion. I choose to listen. There was no grand promise, no impossible vow, only a quiet commitment born from truth, and somehow that felt stronger than any decree. At first, no one moved. Then an elderly woman near the front lifted her head. Her eyes met his, not boldly but hopefully, as if testing whether this new light was real. She nodded once, the smallest gesture of trust, and the tension across the courtyard loosened. A man exhaled. A child peeked from behind a cloak. The silent wall that had long separated ruler from people began to thin, not with magic, but with understanding. The king felt the prophecy settle around him like a cloak that finally fit, not heavy, not forced, simply right. Beside him, the girl's gaze softened. She had never come to change him. She had come to remind him of what he had always been capable of. He turned toward her, gratitude resting quietly between them. You were the sign, he said gently, not because you brought power, but because you brought truth. She shook her head softly. I didn't bring it, she replied. You carried it all along, you just needed the courage to open the door. Oh, their exchange was not romantic or dramatic. It was deeper than that, built on respect and quiet recognition. A warm light rose through the sky, not from fireworks but from dawn itself. The first morning of the new year began to brush gold across the rooftops. The prophecy, once loud and mysterious, now felt peaceful, as if it had finished its work. The child released his hand and ran toward their family, who gathered them in relief. Laughter returned slowly, careful but real. Life breathed again. The king watched, feeling something inside him heal where he hadn't realized it was broken. As the light spread across the city, he knew challenges would still come. Decisions would still be difficult. There would be days when fear tried to return, whispering old habits back into his ear. But now he had seen another way, chosen it, and once a heart has learned to open, it never quite forgets how. He turned toward the castle not as a fortress, but as a home he would need to earn piece by piece, day by day. He looked once more at the girl. They didn't need farewell speeches. Sometimes destinies cross not to stay forever, but to awaken something that must live on its own. With a faint, knowing smile, she stepped back into the soft morning light, not vanishing this time, simply becoming part of the world again, where kindness always quietly moves. He watched her go, feeling gratitude rather than loss. And as the sun finally lifted, touching the highest tower, he understood the truth beneath every line of the prophecy. The kingdom had never needed a stronger ruler. It had needed a kinder one. And on the night the fireworks exploded and the sky broke into light, the vampire king at last became that king days turned into weeks, and the change did not arrive like thunder. It arrived quietly, the way winter softens into spring. The vampire king did not transform his world through dramatic speeches or sudden laws. Instead, he sat among his people. He listened in the markets, in the courtyards, in the gardens where children played. He opened spaces in the castle that had once been locked and allowed light to live there again. He invited voices that had long been silent to speak. At first, many were hesitant. Fear takes time to unlearn, but little by little, trust began to grow where fear had once rooted itself deep. He walked the city at dawn without armor or ceremony and learned names instead of titles. Sometimes he helped lift a cart stuck in mud. Sometimes he listened to grief that had waited years to be heard. Sometimes he simply stood beside someone quietly because not every wound asks for answers, some only need presence. And every night when the castle settled into silence, he returned to the balcony where the prophecy had first stirred his heart and looked across the rooftops, not to ensure control, but to remember why he was leading at all. The council changed too. Men and women who had once spoken only in numbers began to speak in stories, in lives, in consequences that reached beyond the throne room. Decisions slowed not out of hesitation, but out of respect. The kingdom did not become perfect. Mistakes still happened. Disagreements still rose. But now there was space for honesty, and honesty made even difficulty feel lighter to carry. As for the girl, she did not disappear into myth. She lived quietly among the people, teaching, listening, helping wherever she was needed. Sometimes their paths crossed, a simple meeting in a courtyard or along a bridge at sunset. They did not cling to each other desperately. They shared small words, gentle smiles, and the kind of understanding that does not need to be named to be real. She had come not to belong to the throne, but to awaken the heart that wore it, and that was enough. On the anniversary of that new year, when fireworks once again touched the sky, the king stood in the courtyard among everyone else, not above them. Children laughed freely. Music moved through the night without tension. And when the first explosion of light bloomed across the darkness, he felt no fear of prophecy, no tremor of fate pressing down on him. Instead, he felt gratitude for the pain that had taught him, for the truth that had humbled him, and for the quiet courage that had guided him toward a different way of being. He closed his eyes for a moment and remembered who he had been, a ruler built from distance, shaped by fear. Then he opened them and saw who he had become, a guardian who understood that the strongest power in any kingdom is the ability to care. Destiny had not forced him here. It had invited him, and he had chosen to walk. As the last firework faded and the sky returned to calm, a soft wind moved across the stones, carrying the echo of words he once feared. When the sky breaks into light, the king will face his destiny and his heart will decide the fate of all. He smiled quietly, realizing at last that prophecy had never been about predicting the future. It had been about revealing the heart that would shape it. And so the story did not end with a battle, or a crown raised high, or a dramatic farewell. It ended with something far more powerful, a kingdom learning to breathe again. And a king once feared, now trusted, walking into the future with a heart finally awake.